Scott.
What's up, brother?
Good. I'm ready to do it again. I'm ready for another week. I'm ready for another conversation. How are you feeling? How's this week been going by?
It's been one of those weeks of, I have different sort of subtitles for weeks. I call this a migration week. We're kind of migrating our thought patterns to new set of changes, a new set of realities, a now what scenario. We're kind of used to that mindset of change and the rate of change right now. I see that in leadership all over the country. In fact, I see that abroad as well, and actually in your neck of the woods as well.
Yeah, really, when it comes down to my neck of the woods, there's a lot of interesting news here. Like, I'm up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. This is for our friends from the United States. It feels like the little Texas of Canada. Picture hardworking farm folk in the oil industry. So taking a look at what we're hearing with announcements even as early as this morning about refineries on fire globally, and what we're possibly adding up as a global oil shortage. We're a place without a pipe. And that's something that would have been a massively different outcome had we continued going the way that was planned. So right now, there's a lot of turbulence, but I seem to be in this little spot where the sun's kind of shining our way. It looks like Albertans are going to be able to count some more equity in their homes because they missed out on a lot of what was going on in the pandemic, and also get some more opportunity for work to come here.
Yeah, and you know what else in that ray of sunshine in that beautiful town of Edmonton is that you're going to win the battle for Alberta. Go Oilers. Right? So we got the good news for the town without a pipe that, and game one was one of the better games I've ever seen. So looking forward to tonight's game.
Well, it should be fantastic, and what we're hoping is that this continues to escalate, because I know that with Edmonton and Calgary, this runs deep. We haven't seen each other in the playoffs in the NHL for a long period of time, and now it's really exciting for this to be happening right now. Like, what the world needs is a little bit more of these things that people get behind and bond and kind of pull us back from being afraid of each other for the last few years.
That's right. That's exactly right. The shared experience is what builds trust. And this is a great shared experience for everybody.
Oh, man. And I can't wait to share the experience that we're going to share today.
Yeah.
So, you know how, things can mean different things, meaning that sometimes when we say things to other people, we actually say them to ourselves. Yeah. Like when somebody says the word "take me to your leader," like it's affiliated with UFOs and things like that. But for me, I was always like, take me to your leader, like the one inside you, because leadership lives everywhere. And our guest today has crafted himself as a thought leader from inside of a prison cell. I want to introduce Jesse Crosson. Jesse has been out talking about his situation for 9 months. And previous to that, he was actually in a place where he couldn't share his story because his story was progressing inside of a Virginia prison for 19 years. And Jesse, we're so happy to have you on Leadership Line of Sight. Welcome, everybody, to Leadership Line of Sight. My name is Taylor. I am the Chief Marketing Strategist at Gravidia, and I am here with the Chief Change Officer from Crankset Group, Scott Connors. Glad to have you both, and welcome, Jesse.
Thank you, Joe.
So I'm going to try to summarize here, and please feel free to correct me, but my understanding is that you were 19 years into a 32-year sentence.
That is correct.
Where your story took a drastic change was 18 years old, as someone who was struggling with drug addiction, and gone from like a clean record to all of a sudden a 32-year-old sentence and nobody died.
That is correct.
So the way that Virginia handles these things is something that you struggle with. You talk about a lot. Like, what is this system doing? Was it just designed to file people away in a place? Like, are people essentially a crop here? Like the money travels in really weird ways. But just to kind of summarize, all of a sudden you're 19 years in and you were given a governor's pardon. Is that right?
That is correct.
So like the way that I heard the story may not be the way you experienced it, but like 13 years in, you wake up, you're 13 years in with 11 years late, and that afternoon, see ya.
Yeah, 19 years in, I had filed a petition in 2019, and not really isn't any expectation of getting released, but it's kind of this mental practice of saying, okay, I'm going to do everything in my power in this situation, and then I'll let go of the results because ultimately I'm not in control. So I filed it thinking, okay, at least I'll be able to be at peace for the next 11 or 12 years. And then and it kind of built, and all of a sudden I had support, and I had people reaching out and people writing letters, and it started to seem like it was something that could be real. And my girlfriend joked, she said, it's just going to happen all at once. That's the way things always happen. They happen with that expectation. So that morning, actually August 16th, the morning, some guy got released on a pardon. It was a big deal. There were news vans. It was this huge thing. And we were hearing about it. And I was saying, maybe one day that could be me. Like maybe one day I'll have an experience like that. And at 2:00 the afternoon, they called me in the counselor's office and said, Mr. Crosson, are you sitting down? This was Perk in the speakerphone. I said, yeah, I can be. Why? What's up? And they said, well, because you're being released. The governor's granted you a pardon. And so I just like teared up and hit a knee, and it was just so unexpected because this guy had already gotten out. It just seemed so out of the realm of possibility, even more so than under normal circumstances. That, then an hour and a half later, I was walking out and hugging my mom for the first time in a year and a half because of the pandemic. We hadn't had visits. And then Courtney, my girlfriend, it was the most overwhelming and inexplicable day of my life.
Wow. That makes lottery winning seem super money, right? Like that's is that how you feel? I know that you list yourself as second chancer.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely feel like I won the lottery, in more ways than just being released. I was in a prison system that is by far not the worst, but has a lot of work to do and has a lot of things that we need to address, and that's one of my goals. And I was able to have the love and the support and the guidance that allowed me to become the person that I am, and a lot of people didn't have access to that. So the first way I won the lottery was having people who believed in me, who, when I was sitting in the jail and didn't believe in myself and didn't feel like I had a chance, were kind of pushing me to be a better person. Were giving me opportunities to go to school or to learn or engage with the world. And so that was really the beginning of my second chance in winning the lottery. And the next 19 years were really just me making the best of that and making mistakes and kind of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but realizing how fortunate I was and trying to make the best of it.
I can imagine what it would be like, the impact of dealing with the sentencing. So at the time that you were sentenced, being that you couldn't comprehend 32 years because you were only 18 years old, what was it like to meet the first prisoners that had those real long sentences or maybe had progressed through them? Was that where you gained some understanding of what the length of time was?
Yeah, it really was. I was sitting in the jail, and I remember this guy talking to me and said, when you get down the road, you'll find guys that have been there for 20 or 30 years. They've got a 30-year sentence or 20 years in, and they're just doing their time. Like they're making the best of it. He said, when you get with those guys, they'll help you understand. And that was what happened. I went from the jail where most people had 6-month sentences or year-long sentences or 2-year-long sentences to maximum security prison, where all of a sudden, half these guys have life or half the guys have 40 years. And it's like, this is intense. But what I saw was people just living their lives. I didn't see some prison horror show of people just constantly attacking each other or the kind of like rabid animalistic thing we see on TV. It was people getting up and going to work and talking to their families and writing and just living their lives in the best way they could.
What do you think, Scott? I see things just twisting over there.
Well, Jesse, your story is remarkable. And I commend you. I think the whole world commends you for treating the problem as an opportunity. And it sounds like you're going to continue to do that. So congratulations to you, sir. And welcome to the other side of the fence. It's been a while, right?
It's been a while.
I do have a couple of questions for you. I think our listeners, those of us that are parents, what would you want to say to these teenagers that are coming of legal age at 18 quickly, with the freight train mentality? What would you want their children to know to stay away from the things that you weren't able to stay away from?
Sure. There's kind of a trite saying that I think has a lot of truth, that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And that there was this profound sense of disconnection from myself and from the world and from the people around me, that I was seeking something. And what I found in drug culture was a sense of connection, people with a common purpose. You said people who have a common experience build trust. And that was what I was looking for, because I didn't know how to identify with or relate to the people around me. So what I'm realizing now is I just needed to find that connection somewhere else. And it didn't matter where I could have found it. Could have found it in a knitting club or in sports or in any of the many things that kids find that allows them to feel some sense of connection and future and hope. And instead, I found the one group of people that is essentially hopeless. Like I found the one group that had no aspirations, the one group that was essentially determined to fail. And just like everybody else, when I get into a group, I take on some of the characteristics of that group. So I went from having these grand plans and aspirations to essentially giving up because of the company I chose to keep. And I think when we see people going down those lines, we often say, oh, well, you just need to make different decisions. And on one level, that's true. But on the other hand, we need to recognize that the social forces are very powerful. And I didn't understand that at the time. I thought, okay, well, I get to make my choice. But if I'm surrounding myself with people who are making bad choices, I don't really have the freedom I think I do. And that was why, as I got my life together and I started doing things differently, what I realized was not just the things I needed to add to my life, but the things that I needed to take away. And they were those relationships and those kind of associations and those engagements that kept putting me in that position. And that was tough in prison. Like I have buddies that I grew up with that we went through some really difficult things with that I love, but I have to keep at arm's length because of the life they're living. And realizing that it's like, hey, I'll send you a little bit of money, like I'll send you a letter, but I can't be involved in the life you're living anymore because that's not who I am.
So I want every parent out there to hear what Jesse just said, because I think it's really important. The opposite of sobriety, of addiction, is not sobriety; it's connection. And I want everyone to understand what he means by connection to a teenager. Having had a lot of experience in coaching high school football for many years, connection is passion, a passion for something. Your children need to have a passion because it's those activities in that passion, knitting club, to use Jesse's example, that bring connection to others. So what I hear you say, and please correct me if you disagree, make sure that you're engaged with your kids and that your kids are finding something they're passionate about. It's when they're passionate about nothing that they lack the ability to find connection, and that's where the problem starts. Did we hear you well?
Absolutely.
Great.
See, I always think that like you hear things like it takes a village to raise a child, right? But that means that if you are not a child, you need to be an engaged villager. Like there are people that don't understand that everything we do either adds or takes away from someone else's experience. I know that what I noticed growing up was that if you weren't in line with what adults wanted the rest of the children to do, then they would just leave you out. And what they didn't understand from my experience was that when the good team doesn't recruit you, you're not teamless, right? The bad team has a recruitment field day.
Yeah.
How early was it? So like you were sentenced to prison when you were 18 years old. Was it a matter of weeks as you just slipped drastically into this wrong crowd? Was it building for years?
It was building more slowly for years. I started drinking and smoking pot at 16. And it wasn't, it obviously wasn't a good life choice, but it wasn't the most disastrous thing. It was, a lot of bad decisions and a lot of bad, kind of relationships and experiences. But it was finding cocaine 3 months before I went to prison. And it was like a supercharger. My experience went from kind of a slow decline to just an immediate precipice that I fell off of and was like flailing through the air for 3 months until I ended up, committing terrible crimes. And it was shocking to me because I was like a kid taking a year off from college. I was, getting ready to get my life together and figure out what I wanted to do. And then all of a sudden, I didn't even recognize myself. I woke up in the morning in this kind of, when I talk about an animalistic state, it wasn't prison. It was when I'm waking up in the morning figuring out what am I going to have to do to get more cocaine? Like, how am I going to numb this fear? How am I going to stop this feeling that something is coming to get me? And the only way to make it go away is to snort it and shoot it and drink it away.
So when you take a look at like the last point, right? So it was like probably like trending in a negative direction, but then there was this cliff. Yep. And that sudden cliff was not only did you have this requirement for cocaine, you needed it, but it's the money attached to that and the fact that you're affiliated with people that are in that business and maybe want to make some exchanges with you that would lead you to helping them do nefarious things. Now, my understanding is that this culminates with you being chased by people in a car.
Yeah, so there were two separate incidents. One was essentially the sense of need, or we need to get more money for cocaine and we don't know what to do. And one of my co-defendants had worked for this restaurant, and he said, "Oh, they're terrible people, and they steal money from their employees, and they only hire illegal immigrants." And he kind of painted this Robin Hood picture, which is probably entirely inaccurate, but allowed us to justify what we were doing and saying, "Oh, we're not that bad. We're only stealing from thieves." So we broke into this home thinking it was empty because we were supposed to be some huge cash pile, but instead there was a maid there, and we didn't know that. And my co-defendant put a gun in her face and tied her up, and it was this absolutely horrendous thing where not only do we violate this family's space and kind of the sanctity of their home, but we terrified this woman, and there's really no way to explain the impact it has on somebody unless somebody's been through that. And then separately from that, there was, I got a phone call one night. One of my buddies who was there, his girlfriend said, "Look, these guys are at the house and they won't leave us alone and we don't know what to do." And it's kind of a long exchange where these guys had stolen a gun from somebody and sold it to somebody who sold it to me. And then they went back to that guy and said, "No, we need this back, or we need cocaine." So they were essentially threatening his girlfriend and saying, like, "Hey, if you don't bring us cocaine, like, we're not going to leave." And she was scared and she was screaming. So I got on the phone and tried to be a hero and said, "Look, y'all are going to leave her alone or else." And we had words and we agreed to meet. And in the middle of this, cocaine fueled insanity, it seemed like a reasonable idea. But there was this moment of clarity as I got there, like, this is a terrible, this is not, what am I doing? And I just kind of woke up and I left, and they chased me, and I was trying to get away and I didn't know what to do. And they were like driving in the lane beside me and revving the car and acting like they were going to ram into me. And the passenger reached back behind him to grab something. And at the time I was sure he was grabbing a gun and he was going to kill me. So I pulled out my own gun and I shot them. Now, in retrospect, I had no idea. He could have been grabbing a stick of gum. I was not in a rational frame of mind. It was just the most kind of terrified, angry, just out of control I was. And in that situation, I remember feeling so angry, and this is entirely unjustified, I'm not saying, but I was like, I tried to leave, like, you wouldn't let me leave. Like, what's wrong with you? Just leave me alone. But I had created that situation. It took me a while to recognize, like, I don't get to play the victim in a story that I wrote. Like, I don't get to play that part. And really trying to take that responsibility and recognize, like, I created all of those situations. I may have been out of control in those moments, but I allowed myself to get to that place and just created just irrevocable harm.
And so now you find yourself in the system and you're 18 years old and you're not a gangster. So you're getting ready to go into the rabbit hole here, and you got to be scared.
Very much so.
What did that feel like?
So the whole jail culture was just wait till you get to prison. Things are going to be so much better. Things are going to be so much worse. Guys are going to get raped every day. Guys are going to get stabbed every day, but your life is going to be better. And I was like, even at that point where I was still kind of detoxing and like blowing blood bubbles out of my brain, like, something's wrong with this. Like, something doesn't make sense, but I really didn't know what to expect. So I did what everybody else did. And I kind of put on this armor and I tried to toughen myself up and I tried to like prepare myself for the eventuality of violence. And I tried to kind of like fit in and figure out what would allow me to survive. And I realize now, looking back, that none of that was necessary, that all I had to do was be myself and figure out what I was interested in and figure out how I was going to turn this terrible situation into an opportunity. But at the time, I didn't know that. At the time, I thought, like, yeah, I have to do something to survive. This is going to be horrible.
So of the things that people told you to prepare yourself for, how different was the reality of it?
So the picture that they painted was of kind of constant violence and constant sexual assault. And there are violence, like there are moments of absolutely horrible violence and, things that kind of will remain with me for the rest of my life, but they were so rare. I mean, 99% of prison was just incredibly boring or incredibly, plain, I guess. It's those moments, that 1% of the time where you just see something absolutely horrendous, it sticks with you. And it's almost more traumatizing because we're not prepared for it. It's like, if we have the context that, okay, this happens every day or this happens every Friday, we're okay. But when you're just going about your day and you're having a good meal and you're talking to your buddy and you just see somebody getting stabbed in the neck, you're like, how do you process that? And you really don't. And it took me a long time to recognize that, like, that stuff needs to come out. And I didn't really have a way or a place to process it while I was inside. And coming out, a lot of those things kind of bubbled to the surface. And I wasn't ready for the process of kind of reliving those experiences.
So why do you disagree with this statement? Prison is there to change prisoners.
Well, I don't know that I entirely disagree with that, but I think it's probably the way that it's intended. If we think that prison is going to change people for the better, well, we have to look at what it is. Like, if you look at its base concept, prison, we're saying, hey, we have people who can't function in society, so we're going to take them and put them somewhere else, surround them with other people who can't function in society, and then wonder why when they get out, they can't function in society. There is no, at least in the Virginia system, which again is not the worst by far, there is not a great effort at rehabilitation. It is essentially a large practice of warehousing. It's a problem that people don't know how to address, so they just leave it be and say, well, this has existed for a long time, so there must be a reason for it. When all empirical evidence says that what we're doing doesn't make sense and it doesn't work, and yet we expect people to change upon release. And some people, and that's why I say that I was incredibly fortunate from the beginning. I had support and I had access to resources. I was able to go to college. I was able to read any book I wanted. I was able to do a lot with my time because I had those resources. The vast majority, 95% of prisoners, don't have access to any of that. They're kind of on their own trying to find their way. And some are resilient enough and some are connected enough, or some just get lucky enough to find people to help them do that. But essentially, it's the blind leading the blind in a really kind of negative environment that's not providing the resources or the training or the opportunities that we want people to have if we want them to succeed.
Well, let me say this. The prison system is a for-profit system.
Very much so.
And it shouldn't be. If you look at Western medicine and you look at insurance companies and hospitals and big pharmaceutical companies and how that money moves in strange ways, to use Taylor's words, apply it to the prison system, penal systems, and at least almost worldwide that I've been able to see. Not a pretty picture. And I appreciate you being kind in the way that you reference that, people who cannot be in society are not able to, they all get together and are supposed to figure out why they don't reintegrate into society. I respect that. I want to take you back into the prison for a moment. And you had to reinvent yourself. You talked about putting on a tougher armor, but you also use words like resiliency or connections. And so there seems to be a leadership mindset to you, even in your darkest days. So there's something in your DNA that's saying something's not right here. There's something in your DNA that says, okay, I'm taking all the information and I've got a plan for the future. What is it about you versus the other folks you were with in prison that you think brings this mindset that you bring to us today versus the mindset of, when I get out, bad things will probably happen again?
I'd say it's a combination of the kind of good fortune, the connections, the support that I have, as well as the fact that I was raised to believe that I had some sense of agency, that I could have some control over my life, and that the choices I made would have consequences for better or worse. And believing that, like growing up in an environment that reinforced that, allowed me to believe that I could do things differently. The two biggest problems that I saw with the mindsets of people in prison were the belief that no matter what they did, they would be trapped. This kind of external locus of control, this idea that they were not actually in charge of their lives, but that greater forces were shaping them. And then the second one was just a failure of imagination. It was people who saw this false dichotomy of, look, I can get out and I can work a minimum wage job and I can struggle and not afford to feed my family, or I can go sell drugs. Not realizing that there are incredible opportunities out there, that just because they're a felon or just because they come from a troubled past or just because they had difficult experiences doesn't mean they can't reshape their future. And that's one of the main things that I tried to address, especially when I was mentoring, is, hey, you may not be able to be a billionaire. That may be out of the range of possibility, but there's no reason you can't be a successful business owner. There's no reason you can't go to school. There's no reason you can't do a lot of these things. And there was one guy in particular who wanted to get an education, but he couldn't afford to. Nobody in his family had ever gone to college. He wanted to figure out how to do this, and he couldn't afford the tuition, but he found somebody who would buy books for him, like used textbooks. And I said, well, look, at this point it took me 15 years to get my bachelor's. But it was like, at this point, I was like 12 or 13 years. And I said, look, if you can get the textbooks, I'm going to teach you a class. Like every class that I've gone through, we're going to go over and we're going to get you that education. And he went into this thinking like, there's no way, like I can't do college. Like my family's never done college. And by the end, he's writing these amazing essays and he's criticizing, he's doing everything. And he's realizing the power that he has. And he's realizing like, hey, there's nothing different about me and this kid at school other than the fact that he was raised to believe he could go and I wasn't. And so seeing that change in him means he's going to come out with an entirely different mentality and the belief that he can actually make a difference in his life, whereas a lot of people don't ever really get that spark or that belief in them.
Yeah, I think that the way that we treat people and the way that we hold them in our minds can actually determine their outcome. Like, I know that your story kind of resonates with me because I got pretty close to the edge. It could be that I was weeks away from where you ended up. It could have been just the wrong circumstances, but I still remembered that I was with the wrong crowd to the point where I had already been in trouble twice. Things like making fake IDs, but like we knew the people that sold harder core drugs. We knew the people that sold guns, and it culminated in one night where there were guns, and the people that I was with didn't run away from the guns. They ran towards the guns. And that was something that really had me in a moment where I was like, oh, okay, I get it. There is ways to succeed everywhere, right? But it is a part of who you're around. You were just saying before that you become the company that you keep. And I was keeping company with the people that ran towards the guns. And that meant that I didn't, in those moments, have very many options. And so that ended up being a screeching life change for me. I went from this road where lots of people had a lot of money, but you'd get into a car and you'd be like, oh man, this is a sweet car. Whose car is this? And like 3 people that were unrelated would say it was their uncle's. And those are just the slippery paths. Like in the moment, it's exciting. Was that what it was like for you?
Very much so. Initially there was a thrill of this belief. And I had this kind of complicated past because my father was a gangster. Like that was a part of his past, but he had managed to kind of slip away without any serious consequences to almost anything that he had done. Long stories about like selling drugs to federal agents and years later, essentially having charges dropped because the investigation failed or because the officers ended up dying and the evidence was lost. So I grew up like believing these things like, hey, you can go be a gangster. You can go live this exciting life and then get things together and not really have to pay the consequences. And I know that wasn't his intention. I think they were supposed to be cautionary tales, but there was this part of me that wanted to outdo my dad, that wanted to outdo my parents, who wanted to be a better counselor than he was, because that's what he did after he kind of retired from his criminal behavior, or even be a better gangster as a teenager. Like, I can do this better than you did. And the problem was I did it infinitely worse, and I paid the price for that. But yeah, there is a thrill to that. When you're around money and you're around pretty women and you're around all these exciting things as a teenager that are flashy and bright and they suck you in, but ultimately, not only is it destructive and essentially terrible, there's no actual happiness there. Like I have never seen somebody follow that path and be like, I'm really proud of what I've built. Instead, I found people just kind of constantly chasing their own tail or constantly dealing with the consequences of their actions, whether legal or otherwise.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. And sometimes you can't even see who you're with. Like I took a tour to California to visit my wife's nephews. We were there to be awesome to them. I bought them bicycles. We took them from Sacramento to San Francisco, but we were also accompanied by her boyfriend. And sometimes you don't understand who you're standing next to. There was a moment where we ended up down in the section of San Francisco near the docks, and somebody came to meet us, and I didn't know who that guy was either. And the girls were treating this like a normal situation where they're like, oh, you guys just go have a drink, and we'll catch up with you later. And the guy that we went and saw in California ended up being shot in his living room 6 months later, and then we found out who he was. And I still don't know who the third person I met was. And my real point is that people can be in situations that they don't understand. And you were in a situation in prison where you could assume the people around you were generally nefarious to some point, right? But you still had moments where you didn't actually know who you were talking to.
Very much so. Yeah. Probably the one that sticks out the most is I moved from, I got a job in the wood shop when I first got to Nottoway, and it was a way, okay, let me stay out of the way. It's a job. I'll go to work every day. Like I won't have to deal with the kind of prison politics. And so they move you to this wood shop only workers pod. And I move in there and there's this little old man, when the door pops open, I was like, oh, this is great. Like, I know he's going to be quiet. He's not going to be crazy. Like, this is going to be exactly what I need. And then, so we lived together. We watched Jeopardy together. We made meals together. Like, we got along really well. And one thing I noticed was that he was just kind of profoundly disconnected from the world. Nobody wrote him. Nobody took phone calls. Like, he didn't have anybody to talk to, but he had these amazing life experiences. He was a decorated combat veteran. Like, he had worked all over the world. And I was like, this guy deserves to tell his story, to talk to somebody. So I reached out to my stepmom because he had been stationed in Japan and she had lived there while her father was doing missionary work. And I said, hey, would you write this guy? Like, could you just connect him? I think it'd be great to have you send him a letter and maybe you guys could have something to talk about. And a few weeks later, she came up to see me and she said, Jesse, I've got to tell you something. Your cell partner is a serial killer. And that was not the most comfortable thing to hear. And so I go back and I guess I could have left it be, but I kind of feel like, I had told him I was going to try to get her to write. And if nothing else, I wanted to clear the air on that. And I said, hey, Greg, I told you my stepmom was going to write. Well, she told me some things. And he just smiles and he's like, oh, you did your homework, huh? And he kind of gives this laugh. And I was like, what happened to my life? Like, everything was kind of thrown for a spin. And in some ways, the weirdest part of the whole situation was that fundamentally nothing changed about our interaction. Like, I was worried about it that night, and should I go to sleep, and like, should I move, and should I do this? But day to day, he was still the same person he had been. And I think that was probably the most shocking thing. I remember reading years later, someone talking about that no one is just one thing. And that's one of the things that I've had to realize is that I've met some incredibly stone cold killers in prison that are incredibly kind people. I've met some absolute kind of monsters in one area who are very capable in the other, and vice versa. I've met people in the community that I thought were incredibly respectable, and I'm amazed by the work they do. And all of a sudden the police come to their house and find a stash of child pornography that they've been making. And it's like, we're shocked by these things. We're shocked that people are as complex as they are.
So now looking back on this and saying, okay, being that you now have these glasses off, that you see that the people standing next to you at the grocery store are some of the people that end up in the places that you spent long times in, like in prison. And now taking a look at society as a whole, as someone who had as much personal growth as you did inside prison, and looking to save as many of the people like that as you can, how would you change things? Where would you start even?
I would say as early as possible. Ultimately, I think, like I said, it's about connection. But to have connection, we have to be able to communicate. We have to know ourselves. We have to be able to deal with distress. One of the most effective systems I found while I was inside was called dialectical behavioral therapy. We taught it as part of the mental health treatment program, where we had guys who were essentially unable to function in prison. Like, they were the guys who kept getting locked up for incidents of self-harm or violence or lewd behavior. And our job was to manage them. Our job was to essentially be the kind of nexus through which mental health support and security all went, because by having a peer support group, we could essentially understand them a little bit better, or provide direct insight, or say and do things that the guards can't do. We can be like, look, you need to stop that right now. And so we actually taught guys that, every time you feel uncomfortable, you don't have to do something. You don't have to harm yourself. You don't have to get high. You don't have to go punch somebody in the face. Like, it is okay. Distress tolerance is an element of DBT that I found incredibly enlightening, because that was my own experience. I mean, I came to prison because every time I felt uncomfortable, I got high. Like, I did something to change my behavior. I ate ice cream. I got into a fight. I went and tried to get laid. And when I found cocaine, all of a sudden, every time I felt uncomfortable, I used cocaine. And that just kind of started the landslide. So teaching those skills, teaching the coping skills, the emotional regulation, the mindfulness to guys at a younger age may prevent them from going to prison in the first place. Because if we can teach people who are considered unmanageable within the prison system to function well in the prison system, why can't we teach people who are considered unmanageable in society to function in society? It's essentially the same principle. And if we provide those services, whether they're provided in school or through social services or whatever avenue, we can give people the tools they need to succeed before they end up in prison, rather than focusing on what we need to do once they're there.
You know what? That could be the way around the challenges with drug addiction and cocaine. Like, you were talking about the opposite of addiction being connection. And I remember seeing a study that was published in the 1970s, and it was talking about the addictiveness of cocaine and how, like, basically when rats were exposed to it, they would almost choose cocaine over water. Right? Now, that same test was repeated with much better science later. And it turned out when they offered laboratory rats that had a regular rat type enclosure, not just a scientific type enclosure, when they offered them cocaine, only 5% of the rats even tried it. So are those the rats that were disconnected? And in the first study, when it was all just a laboratory situation, is that an example of rats in prison, where everybody would do that to disconnect from their current situation? That's what I really wonder about your perspective on. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you put people under stress, they're not going to perform under ideal, in ideal ways. When you put people in uncomfortable circumstances, they're not going to be primed for personal growth. Again, the thing that allowed me to grow so much was that I had people who were able to make sure that I was financially secure. I didn't have to scramble to get toothpaste. I didn't have to scramble to get a book I wanted. I was comfortable. And that comfort allowed me to reflect on my life and build connections with people and write letters and build relationships. So that comfort allowed me to be okay. Whereas so many of the other guys were working for 27 cents an hour, even though a phone call cost 82 cents. When I first got locked up, a phone call cost $7.25. So they had to work an entire month to be able to call their family a few times. So having that comfort allowed me to change my life. And putting people in uncomfortable circumstances is essentially ensuring that they will not be able to change their life, because they're in this kind of like panic, fight or flight survival mode. And as long as somebody's in that mode, there's no opportunity to reflect. There's only pushing that button for more cocaine or more safety or more security.
And in this instance, what you're talking also about is there's haves and haves nots. And the most important thing to connection is connecting. And the thing that they were charging the most for was those connections. These people were literally working to connect with their families. What statement is that?
Yeah. And I mean, we were part of a profiteering bill in the Virginia legislature this year that have both been sent to a kind of a study committee, because even the Department of Corrections admitted, it's really ridiculous that guys are paying hundreds of dollars to stay in contact with their families every month. Like, if they don't have money, or if their families don't have money, they're not going to stay in contact. And we know what a significant contribution that is to their success upon release. We need to find a way to make that work. Now, rather than just passing the bill as we had written it, they essentially said, we want to study this and find out, what the logistics are. But there was a bipartisan understanding that this doesn't make sense. And I'm glad for that. But we're having these conversations essentially for the first time, because, again, there's this inertia of the prison system. Well, it's been this way, so it must be good. Well, except for the fact that we have more than 20% of the world's prison population and less than 5% of the world's, people population. Like, there's a problem here. And just because something has existed does not mean it's a good idea or works. But people are having that conversation. That's been a big part of what I've been trying to do on social media and out in the world. And when I get opportunities like this, just because it's a human experience. And as long as we treat it as an other, or those people over there, and we don't identify them as human beings, we're going to continue to allow the system to treat them as inhuman.
Yeah, I'm inspired by that. And I like how when you said what needs to change first, it comes from the mental health side. So if we say that someone under stress isn't going to operate very well, we can even see this in basic examples. Like if you try to teach someone something and then have them take a test, and then alter the room temperature, raise it or lower it, it's going to affect the results. So when you're talking about people that live in bad neighborhoods, they're supposed to learn at school where they don't even feel safe, let alone the temperature is not conducive. And you're saying that they underperform over and over again. We may actually have a direct factory from one place to the other.
Yeah. I mean, the school to prison pipeline is incredibly difficult. People don't like to talk about it, but essentially we do the same thing. Just like I said, when someone doesn't know how to behave in society, we send them to prison. When a kid doesn't know how to behave in school, we send them home. Well, if home is a place that they're not learning the skills they need to behave in school, or the skills they need to behave in society, sending them there doesn't help. Either they're returning to an abusive household, or an incredibly dysfunctional household, or an absent household where the parents aren't there, either because they're working 3 jobs or because they're unavailable because of other issues. So we're not giving kids the skills they need. So we take this kid and we said, okay, you don't know how to behave in school, or you lash out, or you don't know how to deal with your emotions, so we're going to punish you by sending you home. We're essentially disenfranchising them further, which increases their contact with law enforcement, because now they're essentially truant with a pass. But what do kids do when they can't go to school and they have nothing for them at home? Well, they go out and steal shit, or they go out and break stuff. They do what teenagers do. And then we're saying, okay, we've now essentially criminalized your inability to behave in school, which is going to lead you to further contact with the criminal justice system, which very often leads to juvenile detention and to prison. Whereas the alternative, and for example, Baltimore school system is doing this, they're saying, when you get in trouble, we need to talk to you. Like, we need to find out what's going on. We need to give you tools to deal with your issues. So all through kindergarten up to high school, they're providing meditation rooms. So rather than going to timeout or being expelled, you go to a meditation room and you talk to a counselor and you say, hey, why are you feeling so angry? What's going on? Like, let's talk about what you're feeling. Let's talk about what you're doing with those feelings. And it's okay to have that feeling, but you don't have to match that feeling with a behavior that hurts you or hurts somebody else. And what they're seeing is lower expulsion rates, lower suspension rates, fewer fights. It's this restorative justice model that can be applied at the family level, at the school level, at the prison level, at the societal level. And it's revolutionary, because it's not what we've done for hundreds of years. It didn't work, and it's actually working, but you still have people that are so entrenched in saying, well, that's not okay. You have to punish people. If people are bad, you have to punish them, regardless of all the evidence that punishment doesn't actually make people better.
Well, especially since the opposite of a reward might be seen as punishment, but I don't think that's true. I think that the opposite of reward is no reward. The reason that people are using deviant behavior is because there is a reward. And for some reason, there's an assumption that we're altruistic, that when we do something bad, we feel bad. But honestly, I think that everybody knows that that's not the case. In fact, I think a lot of people have guilt with the fact that they've done some bad things and don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Now,
Sorry, go ahead.
Now that you've been out of prison for 9 months, I can't even imagine that you feel acclimated yet.
It depends on the day. Those first couple months were shocking and regularly jarring. And now I'll get up and I'll go through the day, and then I'll stop. I'll be halfway, into town, and I'll be like, I'm driving. Like, what is going on? Like, I'm surrounded. I mean, I'll tell you the most shocking though. I went back to speak at one of the prisons, and I thought I'd be nervous going in, and I wasn't that nervous. And I went in, and I saw the rec yard, which really, I don't know why, but that was just kind of like a shock. And I left, and I just collapsed. I had to pull over to the side of the road. I was just streaming tears. I was shaking, and there was no explanation. There was no thought with this, like, oh, this is what happened. It was just, I don't know how to deal with this incredible stream of emotion. And on smaller and larger levels, I've continued to experience that. You know, I was telling somebody the other day, I was watching a dad play with his son, and I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden I just started streaming tears, and there was this like tremendous sense of sadness. And I don't know if that was for what I had lost, or for the harm that I had done, or for the fact that I'm not a father. I don't know what that was, but it's these overwhelming emotional experiences that I got support and help for. Like, I had a psychologist that I could call and say, hey, when I'm losing my mind and I'm feeling emotional, what do I do? Whereas the average guy who, when he feels that, feels like something's wrong, or he's being weak, or there's a problem, because we're not having these discussions. We're not giving people the tools to deal with this. And when I went back to speak at the prison and I talked about this, they said, we've never had anybody talk about this before. They talk about jobs and housing. And I'm like, yeah, that's really important. We need jobs and housing, but we need people to know that getting out is a shock to the system, and that all of the trauma that we've experienced in prison is going to come back. If you've read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it's trapped in there, and it's going to come out somehow. And if we don't address it, it's just going to continue to build like pressure in a kettle.
You just connected something like if your coping mechanism with discomfort is to seek these negative outcomes like drugs and alcohol and other behavior, that's probably where that loop starts, where you come out of prison and you can't cope with being out of prison. So you seek those old solutions that lead you back to the same place. Is that the cycle?
I think there are 3 cycles. I think that's one of them. Not understanding that change is uncomfortable and that we have to adapt to that. The other cycle is economic, is getting out and not having housing and not having a job and being denied for both because you're a felon. And then saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I've got to figure out how to pay this child support, or I've got to figure out how to do this. And ending up in a position where, hey, I can go back to selling drugs and I can probably get on my feet in just a few days or just a few weeks. And then that becomes thing. And then the other thing is the tools that we need to succeed in prison are not the tools we need to succeed in society. So if learning that every time somebody gets in your face, you need to make him back down, or you need to defend yourself, or you need to stand up for yourself, that's not a helpful thing, because then all of a sudden you're in an environment where somebody bumps into you and you're going to make them apologize because that's what prison tells you to do. But that's not what you need to do in society. The idea of commanding respect and of making people, respect you in a certain way is only going to destroy us in prison. And that's how people go back, destroy us outside of prison. That's how people go back. That's how people get assault charges. That's how people kind of lead down this negative path, because we're not giving them the skills, and we're essentially teaching them a really maladaptive set of skills while in prison for the world.
Yeah, I can definitely understand what you're saying there. That's a lot to unpack, and you've had a lot of time to reflect on this. I think that the assumption is that when you're in prison, your world becomes very small and you don't see a lot of what's going on. But I imagine that you watch the news from inside. What's the perspective like from there? When you see things like right now, something that's happening is the purchase of Twitter by Elon, or in some stage of happening, maybe or maybe not. Is that something that you feel as though is just window dressing, or was that something that was part, or news like that, was that part of being in prison as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's not everybody that's engaged, but I watch the news more in prison than I do now that I'm out, because I don't have time. But the guys and the number of educated, intelligent conversations you have blow people's mind, because guys are interested and they're hungry. There's no stimulation. So they say, okay, I'm seeing this on the news. Let me go look into this. Let me understand what Twitter is. We don't have access to the same resources, but they're going to go in there to do research. Or if they're lucky enough to have family, they're going to say, hey, will you print me some stuff off? Or will you send me some information on this? And I want to learn, how do you buy a company? How do you do a hostile takeover? How do you negotiate? And all of a sudden they're going into the 1980s textbook in the library, because that's the only thing available. And they're studying on a topic that they're interested in. So you have guys that are history majors, you have guys that are political that know these incredible masses of information, usually from 30 years ago, because they're the only textbooks available. But the level of education and the level of conversation is astounding, and people are so surprised. The example I think of is, I remember I think it was a Yale debate team went up against the New York State prison debate team, and they said, well, we'll do this as kind of a charity event, and they got demolished. Because as smart as they were, as educated they were, as in many opportunities, what they didn't have was the sheer mass of time that the prisoners had to study and work on their craft. And people were surprised, like, I thought prisoners were stupid. No, prisoners are often people who have a lack of opportunities and don't realize their own worth. But once they find something and they feel that hunger, they latch onto it as completely as possible.
I see that. Sorry, just had a pop there, but we are bringing in some news because I want your perspective. Now, Scott sends me a few things each week, and I think that what we have here is share of U.S. homes valued over $1 million or more. This is directly related to what you were talking about in affordability for those people that are trying to recover. But Scott, can you unpack this before we have Jesse respond?
Actually, I don't want to lose to the prison debate team. I'm going to let Jesse go first.
Okay, what do you see, Jesse?
Obviously a dip after the 2008 crisis, but yeah, houses growing almost exponentially out of control or out of, price range of normal people. And that's one of the biggest areas. So I came back to Charlottesville, Virginia. That was where I came back to. And what we found was that despite the fact that I managed to get a job and that I'm doing fairly well and that I have a girlfriend and we have a steady income, we could not afford a house in town. We couldn't even afford rent in town. And we had to get a place 30 minutes outside of town because it was the only place we could afford. And it's not just us, it's the police officers, it's the teachers, it's anybody who works for the city or the county, because housing is just so completely out of control. And we have an upcoming law in Virginia, a change to the ESC, the Earned Senate Credit Law, and we're going to have between 3,000 and 5,000 people with nonviolent charges getting out of prison. Well, we are struggling and busting at the seams with the system as it is. There isn't enough housing. There aren't enough halfway houses. There isn't transitional support. And now we're going to throw thousands more people out into that system. And it's just a huge red flag that, hey, we need to do something about this. Like, we need to address housing at the most fundamental level, because if people don't have a place to live, or people have to travel 2 and 3 hours just to get into town, and I'm not talking about San Francisco, although that's a great example. I'm talking about just a small town in central Virginia. Something is wrong here.
Well, that's the other thing that I'm really involved in is real estate. And as somebody who talks to average families and helps them win at the business of being a family, I'm passionate about things that are becoming major topics right now, which is affordability, right? Like what they say in real estate is drive till you qualify. And that's probably what you were kind of experiencing there in your situation, was you have to move out. But that's also going to put the crunch on businesses. So often businesses are trying to hire from inside their commuter range, right? You were giving an example of like San Francisco. Well, how many of the people that can get good paying jobs in San Francisco can no longer afford to be in that commuter range? When you take a look at statistics, some of these places are only 4 times the average income to buy the average property. I think that Virginia is actually something that's coming away from that. But some of these markets are 11 to 17 times the average household income to be able to buy the average house.
Yeah. Now let's look at it from a market perspective. Let's take the fact that it's someone's home out of it for just a second. But by the way, I understand, and where we are, I empathize with the reality that we're talking about people's homes here. But let's set it aside for a second and just call it the product. When the product of something, when the price of a product of something goes up in price, the obvious, fewer people can afford it. When fewer people can afford it, normally what happens is prices come back down because demand goes down. And that's a little bit about what we're going to see in the coming months, is people are just going to stop looking for houses. So what you now have is a product sitting there that's not coming down in price because it costs so much more to build, because the land costs went up, because of all the cost, the hard cost into it. And now all of a sudden those construction loans start to come due, or your mortgage, you had a job change, you have to sell, no one can qualify. You're going to have those issues. So we're starting to see corporations come in and start to buy houses as well, which is artificially also increasing the prices. So product and price, lack of people, what we start to have is that innovation gap. And how can we innovate to make it more affordable, right? And so, for instance, an example would be anyone who comes out of the penal system in the state of Virginia can qualify for a minimum of this house, and the state will subsidize the payments for the first 6 months. Never happened in reality, Jesse. You and I both know that, but it's innovative thinking that'll get us to that rebalancing. So what I see coming in that graph is innovation and opportunity. For instance, underwriting guidelines, qualification ratios, debt to income ratio getting tossed aside, and looking at the fact that these people just paid $3,000 a month for rent for the past 25 years. I think they can afford a $2,500 mortgage. Yeah. Check, put them in the house. So you start to see some innovation in the marketplace, any marketplace that's product and price disparity. and then you start to see an influx of innovation. And I think that's what I see in that graph is I'm waiting on the innovation. We're starting to see some changes in underwriting guidelines now.
To respond to what you were saying, Scott, we also have to consider inflation and where it went. So inflation is being caused by all the stimulus cash that was put into the market. If you put more money into a system, then goods and services are going to cost more. You can't just make more money by making more money. Now, during COVID, all the things that we used to spend our money on changed. People weren't living outside their homes, they're living inside their homes. Entertainment had to happen there. We used to spend a ton of money on entertainment, and during COVID, that massively changed. And we also had problems we didn't have before. We had to work from home, school from home. Did we have rooms for this? Did we make plans for this? We didn't. But we had some extra cash because a lot of us didn't end up adjusting with the market to what the market opportunity was. And on top of that, we were no longer spending our money on entertainment and travel, and real estate consumed that value.
Yep.
So a lot of these places where prices have come up now, they have to realize that every economic truth starts with a consumer reality. And the reality of consumers is that they have more options than real estate to spend their money on. And I think that that's going to change things. We're going to talk about things related to interest rates and so on. But I really think that this is the end of that inflationary focus into real estate throughout the US and Canada.
Yeah, and I think the inventory is going to take some time to absorb that because of the supply chain, in addition to that created scarcity of the materials and of the labor and the ability. So there's a lot of cost in some of these newer constructions, and that's going to come down like a rock too. I agree with you. Inflation plays a big part here as well. Artificial inflation from stimulation.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing that you had sent over was the Fed that failed. Can you unpack this a little bit?
Jesse, do you study any of the Federal Reserve or monetary policy or any of that?
Not since undergrad.
Fair enough. So the Federal Reserve is the central bank in America, United States, and its job is to control inflation and to administer monetary policy. A lot of it's statistical. A lot of it has to do with the velocity of money or how fast money is changing hands. It also has to do with money supply. We call it the M1, which is the supply of money that the Federal Reserve will put into the system or take out of the system. And the way they take money out of the system is they'll actually go out there and they'll actually buy bonds, and that puts money in the system because they trade the bond for the cash, right? Or they'll sell bonds and people pay for those bonds with cash, and it brings money out of the system. So there's a lot of different tools that the Federal Reserve will use to try to keep us in a place of slow, steady growth, not too much inflation, not too much price pressure. And then what we've seen from COVID and the stimulus and all things around the last 2 years is this hyperinflation, or prices really going up. We have a food shortage. We have a food crisis. We have an oil crisis as of today. Those imbalances create higher prices artificially. And so what that refers to when the Fed has failed is, to Taylor's point, is that we looked at this inflation as being based upon textbooks from the 1980s, in like you would see in economics textbooks back then. In other words, inflation just happened because of supply and demand, and that more supply, more demand, less supply. That's just not the case. The case is we have all this extra money to spend.
But I think the story is, don't believe in adults. Nobody knows, and they lie. They tell you they know. Right. So I'm going to bring this in a different way. Jesse, they have so many tools in a prison. They've got giant walls. They have so much staff. They control what you eat. They control the space you're in, what you're wearing. How much is happening in any given prison that they don't want to happen?
A massive amount.
Like massive amount?
Yeah. I mean, and again, Virginia is not as corrupt and out of control as some of the other states or the federal system where you see these just insane stories. But yeah, I mean, and a large component of that is a lack of staffing and a lack of investment in the prison personnel. Well, if you pay people not a livable wage, well, they're a lot more likely to then say, hey, I could supplement my income by bringing in cell phones or drugs. Or if you don't pay people a livable wage, they won't work there. And then you have these massive issues of staffing where rather than 100 officers on shift, you have 40. And, they can't really do everything with 40 officers if they need 100. They're not paying counselors enough. They're not investing in guards. They're not investing in training because it was in 2017, I think, they had a 91% turnover rate. So it's really hard to train people efficiently if 9 out of 10 of those people are leaving within the next year. So one of the issues is we're not investing in guards. We're not investing in the prison system itself. And then it's not working and we're shaking our fist like, why isn't this working? Well, imagine if you tried to run a business and you didn't pay your employees enough and they did a crappy job and then, your business failed. Well, that's actually a failure on your part of not investing in your own business and your own idea and recognizing what will get you those returns. And until we do that, we're going to continue to have a system that is churning out high recidivism rates. It's churning out high turnover rates for staff. And it's churning out, not only that, a huge dissatisfaction. People don't realize that prison guards experience PTSD at a higher rate than military veterans. Their rate of alcoholism, of spousal abuse, of these serious issues is high because it's a non-rewarding, non-meaningful job that is incredibly stressful and underpaid. You're asked to do a lot. You're given a responsibility for things you can't possibly do. So we're failing the prisons, we're failing the prisoners, we're failing the people that work there, and we're failing society by not protecting public safety.
I totally agree. And so to extrapolate that same situation under that much control, right? And then say, okay, this when they talk about what they're doing with inflation, what they did during COVID, which was that they were going to make us all safe, there's no way they could deliver. And now that they're saying, oh, we can control this inflation with interest rates, what do you think after your experience of how the government's treated you?
I would say it is a certain level of arrogance to believe that we have that level of control or even that level of understanding. Because if we can't, with all the empirical data in the world, that, for example, the Norwegian prison model works significantly better than the American prison model, yet because of political issues or because of personal issues or, again, just kind of social inertia, if we can't adopt that model in this country, well, how are we going to actually adopt like kind of modern evidence-based economic models? Because there's just... It was like Alan Greenspan and all the kind of issue about him, how everybody said, I'm going to dig him up from the grave and I'm going to put him back in the office. And then we realized, like, no, his policies led to the 2008 collapse. So the inability to be kind of flexible and the inability to say, you know what, we need to adapt with the data as it comes in and actually work with the evidence as it exists. I think that exists across the sphere. And I think in some ways it is kind of the driving force of American economics, and it's the ultimate heel. And it's probably more so. I don't know enough about the world to really extrapolate from there. But yeah, we have systems and we're successful when we say, hey, this worked, we're going to keep doing it. And it's these new minds and these new people that are succeeding in business because there isn't the level of bureaucracy, or you can have open competition, and they're able to succeed because they have a better method or they have a better idea or they have a better implementation that doesn't exist at the kind of bureaucratic level because there's no incentive for it to.
I think that that's a great perspective. And when we devalue people based on what they've done, when we devalue their opinions or their ability to contribute to society, I think that we lose out on some pretty valuable players. Because my point to what I was talking about earlier with the fact that you always don't know who you're standing next to, we champion people and they turn out to be monsters, is just to understand that we got to keep the circumstances correct. Like in the right environment, people will flourish, and under the right circumstance or under the wrong circumstance, they will do things that would massively surprise you, especially when they have too much power. And being aware of that means that we maybe should reconsider how we've centralized the power and who says that they're going to fix things, because these people just don't deliver.
And the arrogance and the lack of adaptability, to Jesse's point, is they use old tools for new problems. Rather than defining a new word of post-pandemic imbalance of supply and demand has created shortages, which has led to higher prices, and we see this as a short term. Let's have a new way of thinking because it's a new thing, and not apply an old tool the old way to a different problem just because it looks the same.
That was a big part of the population you were referring to earlier when you were talking about the incarcerated population of the world, right? When you are looking at other prison systems, you mentioned the Norwegian system is something that should be considered. Is there any other things that you really think that should be core in how we view essentially crime and punishment?
Sure. I think, as you said, taking into account these circumstances is hugely important, and that isn't done to a large degree. But as strange as it sounds, we have a system that has no focus whatsoever on accountability. In 19 years in prison, there was only one time that I was asked to talk about or take any accountability for the actions I had taken. And that was during a victim impact program, which was essentially from the restorative justice model. And it was a pilot program not available at all the prisons. So if we're not taking into account the circumstances and we're also not asking people to be accountable for their actions, what exactly are we doing? And so I think accountability is the beginning of change, because until we're accountable, we can't accept our role in things and we can't begin to change. And as long as we're able to kind of continue in this delusion or this denial or this justification, well, people are probably not going to change. So if we can move towards a restorative justice model that says, okay, even if the victim doesn't want to participate, we're going to do our part. We're going to ask you to take responsibility. We're going to ask you to be accountable, and we're going to verify that you're essentially doing that. We're going to check into the ways that you're addressing your behavior, you're making changes. And if you don't, well, we probably shouldn't just send you back out the door with, a welcome back note because you're going to be back in 6 months. Instead, we should have some metric of expectation of change.
Jesse, I want to, as we close up today, I want to ask you this question. And I think that it resonates to everybody that's listening or will listen. And I'd like you to take us through the journey, in your words, your journey of how you forgave yourself and how you said, you know what, man, it's okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we went through this. I'm sorry this happened. I forgive you. How did you go through that redemption period?
It's a great question. And it was a complicated process because, as Taylor said, there were things that I felt incredibly guilty about. And then there were things that I felt guilty about not feeling guilty about. And as I looked at all the harm that I had created, the biggest issue I had was this sense of shame, this sense of irredeemability, that I am just broken, I am terrible, I am wrong. And it was separating the fact that who I am is not what I've done, and that I have that agency. I have the ability to make different decisions and make different choices. And essentially what I have to do is be accountable and recognize this is exactly what I've done. These are the choices I've made, and these are the consequences. And then from there, I can actually evaluate, hey, how can I do things differently? And what do I want to do differently? Hey, if doing all these things for myself and only for myself is not only not making me happy, it's also causing a tremendous amount of harm. How can I do things for other people? How can I contribute to the community around me and give something back rather than taking? And as I went through that process, what I noticed over a period of years was that I was becoming someone other than the person I had been, that my life, the patterns or the kind of qualities that I was living were not the person that I had been. And when I woke up one day, like really and truly and completely, and recognized that I was not the person that I was, that I was not the person who could still do the things that I had done, that where I was and how I was living my life was fundamentally different, I could forgive myself for the choices I made in the past because I've done the work to not be that person.
Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. And thank you for doing, like, you used your time very well. The changes that you made with the little resources that you did, like, you can tell that you were building the version of you that's out doing wonderful things now. I understand that you're a motorcyclist, that you've you're now a jiu-jitsu practitioner. And I think you found a very fitting martial art.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today. This has been Jesse Crosson. He is the CEO of and founder of Night is Day LLC, where he's helping people make changes within themselves. There's so many people that can learn from his example of change. And I know that there's so many people that they won't make a change until the pain they're in is worth the pain of change. So I hope that you can show people and they can use your pain. They can use the things you've been through to make that change within themselves. Thanks for joining us today on Leadership Line of Sight. With myself, my name is Taylor Hack. I am the marketing strategist at Gravidia, and I'm here with Scott Connors. Scott is the Chief Change Officer at Crankset Group. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.